The night my brother got engaged, I was the one who served the champagne. Not as a guest. Not as a sister. As the person who refilled glasses, collected empty flutes on a silver tray, and kept her eyes on the floor when the photographer asked the family to gather for a photo. I stepped back without being told. I already knew my place. My name is Hazel. I'm 34 years old. And for most of my life, I believed that was simply who I was. The one who worked, the one who waited, the one who made everything easier for everyone else, and received nothing in return. I want to tell you what happened at my brother's wedding last May, at the Dunmore estate outside of Ottawa. I want to tell you about the moment a complete stranger looked at me across a crowded ballroom and changed the entire direction of my life. But to understand that moment, you first have to understand how I got there. My parents, Thomas Holt, 61, and Patricia Holt, 58, took me in when I was 6 years old. That's how they always has framed it. Took me in. Like I was a stray. Like I should be grateful every single day for the roof over my head and the food on my plate, and maybe I was, for a while. Children are remarkably good at finding reasons to love the people who are supposed to love them back. My brother Nathan Holt, 31, was their biological son. 4 years younger than me. They never let either of us forget the difference. Nathan had hockey equipment every season. I wore the same winter boots 2 years in a row until my toes went numb on the walk to school. Nathan got tutoring when he struggled in math. I was told that school was a privilege I hadn't earned and that I could study on my own time. After I'd cleaned the kitchen, done the laundry, shoveled the driveway, and made sure Nathan's hockey bag was packed and ready by the door. Nathan had a bedroom with a lock on it. My room didn't have a door at all. They'd removed it when I was 9 because, Patricia said, I had nothing to hide and nothing worth hiding from. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that this wasn't a family that simply had favorites. This was a family that had decided deliberately that one child was a person and one child was a resource. By the time I was 16, I had stopped expecting anything different. I cooked most of the meals. I handled most of the cleaning. When Thomas's colleagues came to dinner, I served them and disappeared into the kitchen and washed the dishes while Nathan sat at the table and talked about his hockey stats. I was introduced to guests as the girl who helps out around the house. Not their daughter. Not even by name sometimes. What kept me sane was numbers. I was extraordinary at math. I taught myself, late at night, borrowed textbooks from the school library, and worked through them at the kitchen table after everyone else was asleep. My teacher, Mr. Adeyemi, noticed. He found me a scholarship application in grade 11 and helped me fill it out in secret. I won it. Thomas and Patricia refused to let me go. They told me I was needed at home. So I stayed. I worked a cleaning job at a hotel on weekends, the kind of job where you're invisible by design. I saved every dollar I could. I taught myself to use spreadsheets on the library computers, then accounting software, then basic bookkeeping. Not because I had a plan, exactly. Just because I needed to feel like my brain was still mine, even when everything else wasn't. Nathan grew up, went to college on Thomas's money, came back with a degree in business administration, and a fiancée named Charlotte Webb, 29, whose family I knew nothing about until the engagement party, where I served them champagne. Charlotte was warm. She had that particular kind of warmth that makes you trust someone instantly, the kind that comes from people who've always felt safe in the world. She thanked me when I refilled her glass. She looked me in the eyes. I almost didn't know what to do with that. Her father was there too, Henry Webb, 63, a quiet man with silver hair and the kind of stillness that you see in people who've spent a long time paying attention to things others miss. He was a retired civil litigation lawyer from Toronto. He'd had a long career in estate disputes, inheritance fraud, cases involving forged documents and hidden assets. He told me none of this that evening. I didn't learn any of it until much later. What I knew, standing there with my tray of champagne flutes, was that he watched me. Not in a strange way, in a careful way. Like he was trying to place something. I told myself I was imagining it. The months between the engagement and the wedding were some of the hardest of my adult life, and my adult life had not been easy. Thomas and Patricia expected me to help coordinate the wedding, not as a bridesmaid, not as a family member, but as unpaid labor. I addressed 300 envelopes by hand because Patricia said it looked more personal. I spent 2 weekends arranging centerpieces in the church hall. I ironed Nathan's groomsmen's shirts the morning of the ceremony and pressed Charlotte's mother's blouse and packed the wedding emergency kit with safety pins and stain remover and fashion tape and 2 extra pairs of nylons. I was not in the wedding party. I was not seated with the family at the reception. When the seating chart went up, I found my name at a back table near the kitchen, listed between the venue's event coordinator and a cousin nobody had seen in 11 years. I cried in my car for about 4 minutes. Then I blew my nose, fixed my mascara, and went back inside to finish setting out the escort cards. The Dunmore estate was a converted heritage property, about 45 minutes west of Ottawa, the kind of place with stone walls and ivy and chandeliers that had been there since the 1890s. The ballroom had tall windows that looked out over a garden that was just starting to green up after the winter. It was genuinely beautiful. I noticed that, despite everything, I've always been able to notice beautiful things even when I'm miserable. It's one of the only luxuries that's never cost me anything. The ceremony was at 4. By 6, cocktail hour was winding down, and I was helping direct guests from the terrace into the ballroom for dinner. That was when Henry Webb appeared beside me. He didn't ask me to do anything. He just stood next to me, watching the guests file in, and said quietly, "You're Thomas and Patricia's daughter." "Their adopted daughter," I said. The distinction was automatic. I'd been trained to make it. He nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something. "How long have you been with them?" "Since I was 6. Another nod. "And your parents before that?" I looked at him. "Nobody ever asked about that. They died when I was young," I said. "A house fire." Henry Webb went very still. "Do you know much about them?" he asked. "No," I said. Thomas and Patricia never really talked about it. He excused himself a few minutes later. I assumed that was the end of it. I went back to work, helped seat elderly guests, smiled at people who didn't know my name, and found my place at the back table when dinner service began. I was on my second glass of water when Charlotte slid into the empty chair beside me. "I owe you an apology," she said. I blinked. "For what?" "For not realizing sooner." She glanced toward the head table, where Nathan was laughing at something his best man had said. "I asked Nathan why you weren't at our table. He said you preferred it this way, that you liked to stay in the background." She paused. "That's not true, is it?" "It wasn't a question. It's what they're used to," I said carefully. Charlotte looked at me for a long moment. "My dad wants to talk to you," she said. "After dinner. Please don't say no." I didn't say no. I didn't know what I was agreeing to, but something in her face made me feel, for the first time in a very long time, that someone was on my side. Henry found me near the garden doors at around 9 o'clock, when the dancing had started and the noise level in the ballroom made private conversation nearly impossible. He steered us to a small sitting room off the main corridor, the kind of room estates like this always have, with a writing desk and 2 leather chairs and a lamp that gave everything the color of old paper. He sat down across from me and set a manila folder on the table between us. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to stay calm, because what I'm about to say is going to be difficult to hear, and I want you to be able to think clearly." I almost laughed. Calm was something I'd had a lot of practice at. "I knew your parents," he said. "Your biological parents, Catherine and Stephen Mercer." The names landed somewhere in my chest I hadn't known was empty. "Catherine Mercer was my client for 11 years, he said. "Before she died, she and your father, Stephen, were the principal shareholders of Mercer Capital Group. It's a private investment firm based in Toronto, still operating, still quite significant." He opened the folder. "You are named in Catherine's will. You have been named in it since before you were born." The will was filed properly with the Ontario courts. The problem is that for 28 years, no one has been able to locate you. My mouth was completely dry. That's not possible. I've lived in the same city my whole life. You've lived under the name Hazel Holt, he said. The child named in the will is Hazel Mercer. Your birth certificate, the original one, lists your parents as Catherine Ann Mercer and Stephen James Mercer. The birth certificate Thomas and Patricia registered you under, shortly after the fire, lists them as your legal guardians under a private arrangement. He paused. There was no legal private arrangement. I've checked. I stared at the folder. I didn't touch it. The fire, I said. The fire was investigated at the time as an accident, he said. Gas line failure. It was ruled accidental within 6 weeks, but your parents had changed their life insurance beneficiary 3 weeks before the fire. Catherine called me the day before she died. She was worried about something. She didn't tell me exactly what, but she said she was going to send me documents. They never arrived. He looked at me steadily. I've spent a long time wondering about that. The music from the ballroom was faintly audible through the wall. Someone was laughing. I could hear glasses clinking. Thomas and Patricia, I said slowly. They were, what? Friends of my parents. Thomas Holt worked for Mercer Capital Group for 6 years. He was let go 8 months before the fire. There was a dispute over missing funds. It was settled quietly, he wasn't charged, but he was terminated. Henry folded his hands. He knew your parents well. He knew the estate. He knew about you. I thought about my childhood. I thought about every time Thomas had told me I should be grateful. I thought about Patricia telling me, when I was 12 and crying, because I'd been left out of a school trip they'd refused to fund, that I didn't understand how much they'd sacrificed for me. I thought about how I'd believed her, how I'd carried that guilt for years. What do I do? I asked. First, Henry said, we do nothing tonight. You go back in there, you smile, you do whatever you normally do. You give no indication that this conversation happened. He closed the folder and slid it across to me. Second, you take this home and you read every page. Third, you call me in the morning. And Thomas and Patricia? They've been managing a modest estate in your name for 28 years, Henry said, lutted. Legally, given the terms of your mother's will, certain assets were held in trust until your identification could be confirmed. Those assets have been quietly administered. I suspect not in your favor. He said it without emotion, the way lawyers say things when they want you to understand severity without panic. There will need to be a formal investigation. I took the folder. I went back into the ballroom. I smiled. I helped Patricia find her reading glasses when she couldn't locate them in her purse. I hugged Nathan and Charlotte when they left for their hotel. I carried gift boxes to Thomas's SUV and held the door open while he and Patricia loaded them in. Thomas patted my shoulder on the way out. Good job tonight, he said. You were useful. I smiled at him. I held it together until their taillights disappeared down the gravel drive. Then I sat on the front steps of the Dunmore estate in my good dress, and I pressed my hands flat against my knees and I breathed. Catherine, Stephen, Mercer. My parents had names. My parents had had a life. My parents had loved me enough to write my name into a legal document before I was even born. And someone had taken me away from all of it and convinced me for 28 years that I was lucky to be allowed to exist at all. I didn't cry. I was past crying. What I felt was something colder and clearer than grief. The particular feeling of a locked door finally opening, not into warmth but into daylight. Henry Webb was thorough. He'd been thorough for decades. It turned out, he had kept copies of everything Catherine had ever sent him, including a letter she'd written when I was 3 years old, updating her will and explaining, in careful detail, that if anything ever happened to her and Stephen, she wanted her lawyer. Henry Webb contacted immediately, and the terms of the trust enacted without delay. She had specifically listed Thomas Holt as someone who should not be given access to my guardianship, citing the terminated employment and what she called a concerning pattern of behavior. That letter had been in Henry's files for 31 years. The problem had always been identification. Without a child to confirm, without a Hazel Mercer to present to the court, the trust had sat in a kind of legal limbo, administered by a court-appointed trustee who had, over the years, accepted documentation from Thomas and Patricia indicating that I was not locatable and was presumed to have died in the original fire with my parents. They had told the court I was dead. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it took me several days to fully understand what it meant. They had taken me out of that house, they had given me a new name, and then they had told the legal system that the child who survived the fire had not survived at all. They had collected a guardianship allowance from the estate for 6 years before the trustee, apparently satisfied, had frozen the account pending further investigation. They had not gotten what they came for, but they had gotten me, my labor, my invisibility, my silence, for 28 years. Henry filed for an identity verification proceeding with the Ontario Superior Court of Justice 6 days after the wedding. The process required DNA confirmation. Catherine's sister, my Aunt Donna, 67, was still alive and living in Kingston, and she agreed immediately to provide a sample. Henry had called her the morning after the wedding. She had cried for 20 minutes, he told me. She had never stopped looking. I met Donna Mercer for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon in Henry's Toronto office. She walked in and stopped when she saw me, and I saw her face go through something I don't have words for: relief and grief and 28 years of not knowing all at once. She held my face in her hands and said, "You have your mother's eyes, and I would have known you anywhere." I had not been held like that since I was 6 years old. The DNA results came back in 3 weeks. Hazel Mercer, confirmed. The court proceedings moved quickly after that, supported by Henry's documentation, Donna's testimony, the original will, and the records of Thomas's termination from Mercer Capital. The RCMP Financial Crimes Unit opened an investigation 12 days after the DNA confirmation. The charges that followed were specific and serious: fraud over $5,000, breach of trust, identity fraud, and obstruction of justice in relation to the original estate proceedings. Additional charges related to the false declaration of my death were filed under the Vital Statistics Act of Ontario. Thomas's lawyer called me twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. I won't tell you the investigation was quick. It took 11 months in total, from that evening in the sitting room at Dunmore to the morning Thomas and Patricia entered guilty pleas at the Elgin Street Courthouse in Ottawa. Thomas, 61, received a sentence of 4 years federal and was ordered to make full restitution. Patricia, 58, received 2 years less a day and 3 years probation. The court also ordered a forensic audit of all assets held or managed by either of them over the past 3 decades. An audit that is, as I understand it, still ongoing. Nathan, and this is the part people always ask about, so I'll tell you, Nathan did not know, or at least, he did not know the full truth. He knew I was adopted. He knew the family had treated me differently. Whether he had ever let himself think too hard about why, I genuinely can't say. He called me the night the charges became public. He was in shock. He kept saying he was sorry, and I believe he meant it, and I also don't think sorry covers the particular shape of what happened between us. We are not close. I don't know if we will be. I think that's allowed. Charlotte, for her part, has been kind. She sends me messages sometimes, just to check in, just to say she's thinking of me. She said, once, that she'd noticed something was wrong at the engagement party. That I had seemed like someone trying to take up as little space as possible, and that it had bothered her in a way she couldn't name until her father told her what he'd seen. I appreciate her honesty. It doesn't undo anything, but I appreciate it. Mercer Capital Group had been managed by a board of directors in the years since my parents' deaths. The terms of the original trust were clear. Upon confirmed identification of Hazel Mercer, the assets held in trust reverted to me. It was not, in the end, a simple transfer. There were years of management fees, legal costs, and the frozen assets that had never been properly distributed. Henry negotiated all of it. He did it, he told me, mostly because he had spent 30 years feeling like he'd failed my mother by not finding me sooner, and this was his way of making it right. I told him he hadn't failed her. He didn't argue, but I don't think he believed me. I now live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Toronto. It's the first home I've chosen for myself, the first space where every object is there because I put it there, every wall color because I picked it, every Saturday morning because I decided how to spend it. This sounds small. I know it sounds small. But when you have spent your entire life fitting into spaces other people defined for you, having a space that is entirely your own is not small at all. It is, actually, enormous. I am enrolled in an accounting program at Ryerson, Toronto Metropolitan, they call it now. I go to class on Monday and Wednesday evenings. I am, by a significant margin, the oldest person in my cohort, and I find I don't care about that at all. The professor told me last semester that I have an unusually strong intuitive grasp of financial structures. I did not tell him that I'd spent 20 years trying to understand where all the money went. I think about my mother sometimes, Catherine, who wrote my name into a legal document when I was barely old enough to walk, who called her lawyer the day before she died because she was worried, who loved me in ways I'll never fully be able to account for because I was too young to remember. I think about Stephen, who I know almost nothing about, except that he built something that lasted long enough for me to come home to. I think about Donna, who is coming to visit next month, and who has already sent me 3 recipes she says were my grandmother's, written in pencil on index cards that are almost 40 years old. The family you are born into might not be the family that raises you. The family that raises you might not be the family that deserves you. But somewhere, if you're lucky, or if one good man pays attention at a wedding, the family you were always supposed to have finds its way back to you. My name is Hazel Mercer. I am 34 years old. I am exactly where I was always meant to be.